Good evening. It's good to see everyone out. I knew as soon as I started speaking, the volume of the microphone was going to mess with me, so glad that's out of the way. But it's good to see everyone out. It's good to be here. I'm going to have to just go right ahead and unbutton as soon as I button. This is one of those suits that I've had for a couple years, and I think the southern heat has shrunk it. So otherwise I'd usually button up. But I appreciate the invitation coming here, and I'm especially excited to talk to you tonight about the pillar of fire, God's guiding light. If you know me at all, you know that it's one of my hobbies to see Old Testament imagery, enigmatic language in the Old Testament, and trying to find the connection to Christ, because ultimately everything connects to Christ, which is kind of getting ahead of myself. But especially when it comes to the pillar of fire, wow. I'm just now seeing that it's 6:30. I may go a little bit faster. But when you think about the pillar of fire, as we're going to be talking about tonight, it's kind of strange because it almost seems like it's a small detail as you're going through your daily Bible reading. You read through it and you're thinking, that's neat, because there's a pillar of fire at night and a pillar of cloud by day that is leading the people of Israel, especially as you see throughout the Exodus. And while it seems like a small detail, if you just overlook it very quickly, what you're going to do is miss out on, I think, some major lessons that God wants us to learn. In fact, it becomes quite important, as we're going to see in Psalm 105. It starts with kind of the way we sing one of our hymns, "Make His deeds known among the people." And we sing some of those lyrics from that psalm in a hymn of ours in our hymn books. And as it starts that way, it goes through a list of things that we are supposed to be praising God for. Among that list, in verse 39, it says, He spread a cloud for a covering and fire to illumine by night. And so it turns out to be something, not just something that is a small detail. It's quite important, and it's something that the Jews were supposed to worship God for, to praise Him for. So why is it so praiseworthy? Why is it so important? Well, as you see just from the title, it was a powerful guiding light to them. And so don't think that this is important just because this was something that the Jews liked. This is, it was just really cool for if you were, a physical descendant of Israel. No, it actually turns out to be very important even for the Christian today. And so where I want to start tonight is in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, because Paul, I think, makes a very interesting point as you think about some of these lessons from the Old Testament. Over and over again, you have all these lessons from a little age that you can probably go through without even looking at the text. But you see Paul's point in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. In verse 11, he says, essentially, first I'll read it. Now these things happened to them as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Now the ends of the ages, what is that? Well, it's the latter days, the last days that we're living in right now, the days that we Christians are living in. And so we're going to get to the beginning of chapter 10 in just a moment, but understand that Paul, as he goes through a small list of stories, what he says is these things were examples that you were supposed to learn from, not Jews, but Christians. And when you go earlier up in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, beginning in verse 1, just look at a few of the things that he mentions here. These are just a few of a whole host of things that we could talk about. But he says, For I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not well pleased, for they were laid low in the wilderness. Now these things happen as examples for us, so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved. Now, I think that Paul uses some of these things to make some pretty direct points and direct applications. But one of the things that we are supposed to take from this is really, as I started earlier, everything that we have that we have discussed from this passage, everything that you've looked at throughout this week, from the zeal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to the purification, the purification that God gives, and looking at that vision in Isaiah chapter 6, to the presence of God, to the pillar of fire, Into the judgment, I almost forgot Joe Hardy's lesson. The judgment of God that you see, especially at Sodom and Gomorrah, all of those things are supposed to teach us something. And I hope that we're going to see that as we go throughout this study tonight, particularly when it comes to the pillar of fire. And again, I wish that we could spend just a little bit more time on 1 Corinthians chapter 10, because all of those connections he makes are beautiful. You think about baptism. He's talking about how the people of Israel were baptized. There's something that we're supposed to learn about baptism from that. And so don't look at, maybe what we might find as enigmatic language. Don't look at the pillar of fire and think, well, this has nothing to do with us today. It has everything to do with us today. Now, what does it teach us today? And so there's just three main things that I want to mention. I was just talking to Kyle, and I said that there was so many things that would be really fun to go through, but especially as I looked at the clock and we're already at 6:30, we're not going to be able to go through all those things. So just three.
You got till 7:15. I don't know if I told you that.
Oh.
Sorry.
Well, you may get out early then. I will say, I liked how Joe Hardy did it. He kind of went through his lesson, and then at the end of the lesson, he opened it up for questions and comments. That's probably how I'm going to do it, just because I want to make sure that I don't get distracted, because I'm sometimes easily distracted. So that's probably how I'm going to do it today. So just three major things that I want to talk about when it comes to the pillar of fire. And if you want to write down your questions to ask at the end, you're more than welcome to do that. But first of all, I think the main thing that we see from the pillar of fire, one of the main things it teaches us, is that it guides us, hence the title of the lesson. But it really speaks more to not just that the fact that God guides us, but our critical need for His guidance. Back over in Exodus chapter 13, where we first see the pillar of fire and the cloud, in Exodus chapter 13, beginning in verse 21. It says, "The Lord was going before them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead them on the way, and in a pillar of fire by night to give them light, and that they might travel by day and by night. He did not take away the pillar of cloud by day, nor the pillar of fire by night from before the people." So this is really the first time where you see this, and how does it start? What is the first thing that you find the first benefit that you find from this? Well, it is literally used as a beacon in the wilderness. Specifically, it's used as a beacon going through darkness. And you're going to hear the word darkness a lot throughout this lesson. And I really want to hone in on this fact because think about the time that they were in. We can just reach into our pockets and there is a flashlight literally built into our phones, at least most of our phones. And sometimes you don't even have to use the flashlight. You can just turn on the screen on your phone and it lights up the entire room anyway. But it's so accessible today, light. When the sun goes down, we could be in here till midnight. We're not going to, but we could if we wanted to. Now, it's so easy for us to have access to light and to be able to just keep working, keep going throughout the day. Back then, that's not how it was. When the sun went down, the work stopped. Because what are you going to do if you can't see anything? And when, I guess there's still some similarities because it was too dangerous to travel in the nighttime because you don't know what kind of undesirables you're going to meet. There is some application to make today from that. But without the light, particularly in their situation, leaving a hostile power, an oppressive power, just having broken the bonds of slavery, they needed all the help they can get. And when you think about traveling through the night, that was unique only to Israel. No other people could have done that. And so already you start with some pretty impressive feats done by God and by the people of God who are following after Him. Now, so thinking about that without God, without His light, there is no path forward. There literally is no next step that you can take. They are completely blind. One way that I was thinking about this, I remember it was when I was a teenager. I was with, I think one of my brother-in-laws, actually, now brother-in-law, and we were just in the car. It was, I think, after midnight. I don't know what we were doing, probably at the movies or something. Nothing bad, but, well, except for how I was driving, because we were on a back road, and when you get to some of the back roads, there are no lamps, there are no lights, there's just trees, and there's about 10 feet of road in front of you because that's about as far as the lights are going to go. And I remember I was just going as fast as I could. I was going about, well, not as fast. I was going about 50, 55 miles because I was like, oh, I'm a daredevil. And as we were going through, I can't remember which one it was, but one of my brother-in-laws was sitting in shotgun, and he said, "Can you even see the road that's coming ahead?" And I said, "Nope." And he said, because we like to daydream, he said, well, what happens if we somehow get across like an abandoned, broken down bridge and halfway through there's no more bridge? And I said, I don't know what we're going to do. And he said, well, then how are you driving so fast? I said, I guess I'm just driving by faith. But when you think about just going into the farmland, when you think about going out of the city, especially at night, it is kind of dangerous to start driving that fast because you don't know what's ahead of you. It's very hard to take the next step. Well, for these people in Israel, they're leaving Egypt, but the Israelites, it would have been incredibly difficult, impossible, unless they had God. Now, with all that being said, what do you think should be the takeaway from this? Not that we shouldn't drive fast in the darkness. I don't think we should. But specifically when it comes to the spiritual application, without God, we are in the dark. And I'm not just talking physically. We are in the dark if we don't go to Him first. It's easy to think when looking at their situation, well, Israel definitely needed a miracle. How else were they going to get out of this? How else were they going to move forward? The point is not that Israel needed a miracle. The point is that they needed God. That is the main point. And without Him, there is no guidance, there is no salvation. Now, bringing that into our next point here. Oh, did I not put that up the whole time? I think maybe I did. I just don't think I pressed the button. Anyway, that brings us into our next point, is that this guidance is critical, not just in the moment, but all throughout the way. If you want to turn over to Nehemiah chapter 9. Nehemiah chapter 9 in verse 12. This is one of many passages that people way down the road bring up this old story of how God led them through the wilderness. And this is after the period of the judges. This is after the united kingdom, the divided kingdom, after Judah stands alone. It's after that captivity. Once they returned, they're still talking about this. In Nehemiah chapter 9 and verse 12, it says, "And with a pillar of cloud you led them by day, and with a pillar of fire by night, to light for them the way in which they were to go." Skip down to verse 19. It says, "You in your great compassion did not forsake them in the wilderness. The pillar of cloud did not leave them by day to guide them on their way, nor the pillar of fire by night to light for them the way in which they were to go." Now, even all the way up to this point, it was still something that they were praising God for, that they were praying in thanks to Him for. As strangers in the wilderness, they needed that continual direction. They needed that continual guidance. Turn over to Psalm 119, if you would. Psalm 119. You all knew that this is where I was going anyway, so you might just put a bookmark there. But Psalm 119, in verse 19 specifically, it says, "I am a stranger in the earth. Do not hide your commandments from me." Now, this is not one of the Israelites that would have been in the wilderness speaking, but it is still a servant of God nonetheless, a part of His people. And I think that this is very interesting language because they had stories of their ancestors being strangers on the earth, strangers walking throughout the wilderness. And there are even some laws that God gives in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. All throughout, he reminds them, hey, this is how you treat your brother. Remember, this is how you treat the sojourner among you, or the foreigner among you. Why? Because you know what it feels like. Because you were once sojourners yourself. And so you make sure that you treat them the way that you would have wanted to be treated. You treat them like you are a person, a part of the people of God. And so, with all that being said, I think that they definitely would have still had that notion in their minds of what it means to be strangers in the wilderness that need help, that need guidance. When you think about the application today, are we not strangers on this earth? Are we not walking through a wilderness of sorts? Are we not headed towards a promised land? I would love, this is one of the connections that we don't have enough time to go and read through, but Hebrews chapters 3 and 4, it's a beautiful study. I mean, I would commend that to you. But all throughout, he's talking about the people who God delivered from Egypt. And while they had been delivered from Egypt through amazing, marvelous, wondrous feats by God, the 10 plagues, which were amazing in and of itself, and then the Red Sea splitting and walking on dry ground, and then being led by the pillar of fire and cloud, being led with manna to provide for them, water from the rock. I mean, beautiful things, but all the while, what are they headed towards? Canaan, that promised land, that Sabbath rest. And what the Hebrew writer does is make a case from that group of people, from that generation, and says, don't think that the lesson ends there. Just like we were talking about in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, the lesson continues today. Because while we were on this earth, we're headed towards that land where we will have that final Sabbath rest in the Lord. And when we get to that land, all that wandering through the wilderness will be completely worth it. But they missed that rest, this specific generation that was delivered so wondrously by God. And it was because, I think, they stopped looking at that guiding light. They started to look away from it. And so let's not miss the point that they were supposed to learn all the while. Still in Psalm 119. Psalm 119 and verse 105. This is probably one of the main verses for this entire point. Psalm 119 and verse 105. He says, "Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path." I love that verse. I think probably everyone else in this room loves that verse. But I got to ask a question. Do we just quote this because it's cute, because it sounds intimate, or because it's how we live? I know that it's kind of hard to put ourselves in the shoes of the people that literally could not take another step forward in the darkness unless they had God as their light, because it is so accessible to us. There's a bit of there may be some cultural disconnect there, but regardless, I think the point can still be made. When you think about this verse specifically, verse 105 of Psalm 119, I think the imagery that we're supposed to get in our minds is something like the Exodus, where we, like that generation, will not move forward without the will of God guiding us. I am not willing to take another step. I'm not willing to make any action unless I'm acting on the initiative of my Father. A lot like what Jesus said in John chapter 5, verse 19 and verse 30. I love that thought. And when you even look at Jesus being tempted by the devil in the wilderness, in Matthew chapter 4, there's another connection. I think it's beautiful that he's using wilderness language to combat those temptations all in Deuteronomy. But regardless, even Jesus had to suffer through the wilderness of sorts. And so he's able to feel with us. He's able to sympathize with us, as it says in Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 15. He's that perfect high priest that can understand the temptations that we go through. But Jesus, when you look at those temptations and you look at how he answers that and how he combats Satan the whole time, I think it's beautiful because not just that he can sympathize with us, but because he gives us the perfect example of how we are to really utilize this verse in Psalm 119. Essentially what Jesus said with that first temptation, turn this stone to bread. Jesus says, absolutely not. We kind of look at that and say, what is the temptation there? How is that going to be sin? Ultimately, what the devil was trying to do was make him act outside of his Father's will. That is the temptation. But Jesus, the way he answers is essentially, absolutely not. I would rather starve to death than take another step without his will. Are we that dedicated? Are we that committed to making sure that every single decision that I make is based on this will? That in a very similar way to that generation that was delivered in the Exodus, we must not act like we don't need his guidance step by step, not just every now and then, but every single moment. Do we treat his word and his will as a light that we will not be able to see without, or just as a map that we can take out every now and then if I start to get lost? I think sometimes it's a big temptation to think the latter. And so from the very outset, what I wanted to make the case for is that the pillar of fire teaches us about the critical need that we have to how we are supposed to view how critically we're supposed to view God's guidance. Now, when you think about the pillar of light, you also see this notion of, I don't know if I'm just not pressing this right. I feel like I have to press it twice. If the point doesn't come up, you can just tell me. But the next thing that I want to talk about is the surety of God's deliverance through the darkness. Now, the reason it says surety is because assurance was going to be too long and it was just not going to fit the screen. But essentially what I mean is the assurance, the confidence that we should have in God's deliverance. Because the pillar of fire, I think, is used also in this way. Back over in Exodus chapter 14 this time. Exodus chapter 14. It's very interesting because while God is leading them in a kind of an indirect way toward the promised land as he's still trying to think about his people and how they might get a little bit fearful when they see warfare, he takes them kind of the long way around a little bit, and he even kind of uses this to maybe tease Pharaoh. And Pharaoh kind of takes the bait, and so he goes and he starts trying to take Israel back for himself. And in Exodus chapter 14, beginning in verse 19, look at how the pillar of fire and the cloud, incidentally, is used. It says, the angel of God who had been going before the camp of Israel moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them. So it came between the camp of Egypt and the camp of Israel, and there was the cloud along with the darkness, yet it gave light at night. Thus the one did not come near the other all night. I can't love that enough, because you can see them. You can see the opposing army. And what then do the Israelites get to see? They get to see God at work. In fact, you look at verse 24, skip to verse 24, look at the language. At the morning watch, the Lord looked down on the army of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud and brought the army of the Egyptians into confusion. He caused their chariot wheels to swerve, and he made them drive with difficulty, so that the Egyptians said, "Let us flee from Israel." Why? For the Lord is fighting for them against the Egyptians. I can't imagine being an Israelite hearing those words, hearing our very enemies speaking, the Lord's fighting for them, and hearing the trembling in their voice. I love thinking about that, because God uses this not only to guide us, but to fight Egypt, to fight his enemies, and in turn protect his people. Now, what I like about verses 24 through 25 is how they say the Lord is fighting for his people. This actually becomes the basis of all of the surrounding nations' fear of God. This is another connection I'd love to make, but you can just write it down in your notes if you want to and look at it later. But in Numbers chapter 14, when the people actually get to the promised land, before they, as they're trying to reject it and say, even though he brought them up to the very boundary, they say, you know what, I don't think we can actually make it, even though they're right there. But in Numbers chapter 14 and verses 13 through 16, I love how while Moses is trying to intercede for the people, after God says that he will justly destroy them for their rebellion, Moses reminds him, please don't do this, because the enemies, your enemies, are going to hear this, and they're going to think that you couldn't get us across the Jordan. They're going to think that you couldn't get us all the way to the promised land. And he even reminds them, reminds God, but he is trying to intercede for the people with God by saying, they know, and they still speak about you, knowing that you lead us by the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud. I just think it's beautiful that even up to that point, the people are still so terrified of God that they're still going through these stories in their mind. This same God's coming after us. In Joshua, it's just the same. Even 40 years later, Rahab starts talking to the spies and says, we know who you serve. We know whose God is yours. And they're terrified, and rightfully so. And it is because when God fights for his people, how much more confident can you be? In Romans chapter 8 and verse 31, but before we get there, I would just say note that while God does this with the pillar of fire and cloud, this doesn't mean that the danger was gone. What it did mean is that the victory was sure. Now, Romans chapter 8 and verse 31, what does Paul say there? If God is for us, who can be against us? Shouldn't we think in this exact same way, though Egypt may be chasing behind? You know, there's a lot of connections to be made with the bondage of Egypt and sin, which we'll get into in just a moment in a later point. But regardless, when you think about the enemies of God, there may be many, and they may be fierce. They may look like Babylon. But what do you always have the promise of? That God is going to have the victory, and that God is going to provide for his people. Again, that doesn't mean that the danger is going to necessarily subside. Maybe not immediately, maybe not for a long time. But no matter the danger, God is still going to have the victory. And that's something that I think is so easy to forget. I love the way the Bible speaks about God's promises. I think about Luke chapter 2 when Simeon, what a devout man, as he's promised by God that before he dies, before he passes away, he's going to see the reconciliation of Israel. He's going to see the Messiah before he dies. And when he sees Jesus, oh, he knows. He takes him in his arms and he says, now I can go in peace. Why? Because I've seen our salvation. What had Jesus done up to that point? He had cried and drank milk. He was an infant. And even as an infant, Simeon has the faith to say, God has promised it. Who can possibly go against that? Who can possibly win when he has said, this is how it's going to be? And I think that's how we need to look at God's promises today. Just like Simeon, just like the faithful remnant of Israel. When God promises something, when he says something's going to be done, it doesn't matter what the circumstances look like, it will be done. Now, that brings us to the next point. In Deuteronomy chapter 1, well, again, I keep trying to press this button. It's just really hard. Deuteronomy chapter 1 in verse 32. With all that being said, how sure we are supposed to be when it comes to the promises that God gives, when it comes to the law that He has spoken to us. I think it's very easy often to look at that deliverance and look over it, even though maybe we've been saved by it, especially when you look at Israel. Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 32. Deuteronomy 1 and verse 32, beginning, it says, "But for all this, after he's talked about everything God has done for them, how He delivered them from Egypt before your eyes, for all of this, you did not trust the Lord your God, who goes before you on your way to seek out a place for you to encamp, in fire by night and cloud by day, to show you the way in which you should go." Oh, thank you, brother. I appreciate that. Thank you. Appreciate that. That's a real brother right there. Oh. So where was I? Deuteronomy 1, verses 32 through 33. So what do we see here? The people, he's hearkening back to Numbers chapter 14, they were right up on the boundary. They had seen everything they needed to see. In fact, one plague would have been enough. I mean, all of those miracles, that's enough to prove who God was and what He was going to do. But even with all of those things, they fail. And why is it? I think because they looked away from that assuring light that God had given them. We tend to look away as well from that assuring light. And I think we do this particularly when we start to see, the armies around us, or in Peter's case, when he sees Jesus out on the water and he tries to walk out with him, the very moment he starts sinking is when he takes his eyes off of Jesus and starts looking at the waves and looking at the storm. I think it's the same with us. When we look away from that light, and particularly with Jesus, the light of men, that's when we begin to worry. When we look away from that assurance, when we look away from that confidence of the promise made, that's when we begin to worry about defeat. People that struggle with anxiety, depression, addiction, a lot of times what they say is, I don't know if God can do anything about this, especially those with addiction. How in the world could God take this bad habit that I have, how could He break it? And I think the reason that people ask those kinds of questions, it's not because they've been looking in their Bibles. It's not because that as they've struggled with this question, they've dug just vigorously into the text and looked throughout Scripture and seen what can God do. It's because they haven't done that. Because when you go into the text and you start refocusing, reading more, you can't read all of the marvelous victories that God has accomplished and come away still wondering, will God be able to deliver me from this? Will God be able to break my bad habit of smoking, maybe? Will God be able to break my habit of pornography? Let me tell you something. The God that literally split the sea so that the people could walk on dry ground, the God that resurrected many, or a few rather, from the dead. The God that spoke everything around us into existence. Just a word, everything came to be. I think He can break you of your habit. But the reason people think, oh, He can't do anything for me, is because they stop looking at that light. They stop thinking about those assuring promises, and they think about everything else around them. And that is the key, that we can't look away from Him, but we need to keep staring at that light. And so today, I think this tends to happen particularly because instead of just looking around, what we do is look back. We look back to Egypt. If you want to turn over to Numbers chapter 11 very quickly, this is probably one of the most comical passages in all the Bible. Numbers chapter 11, this is another instance where the people they fail so astoundingly. Numbers chapter 11 and verse 4. They keep complaining even though God is miraculously providing for them every single day. And the pillar of fire and cloud are still in their midst, leading them all throughout the wilderness. In verse 4 of Numbers chapter 11, it says, "The rabble who were among them had greedy desires, and also the sons of Israel wept again and said, 'Who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish which we used to eat free in Egypt, the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic. But now our appetite is gone. There is nothing at all to look at except this manna.'" I'm sorry, but this is truly one of the most hysterical things that you could possibly imagine. I mean, think about going through the wilderness all this time. You think it's hot today. Think about, going camping in this kind of weather for an extended period of time while you're on your way to the promised land. And then hearing some of your brethren, some of those a part of the assembly of Israel, and they start saying, I know what we've gone through to get to the promised land. And I tell you, I remember the evils of Egypt. I remember how much they hurt us, and unjustly. But the onions, though. You ever think about that? How absurd. How idiotic. How can you possibly start to look back at the oppressive bonds of slavery in Egypt and say, oh, but I would take it all back if I could just have some of their bread, just some of their fish. What kind of lunacy? But this is what they did. You can read it again, and they do it a couple of other times too, as they complain about the provisions that God has given them. As they're complaining, and this isn't because of a lack of food. God has provided for them every single day. But this is what we do when we don't keep, I would say, in Romans chapter 6, the old man that's supposed to be put to death. Sometimes I think we don't necessarily put him to death, and I think that's what their problem was. They hadn't put it completely behind them. Rather, that old man was striving to come back, and they were looking back, entertaining those thoughts. We do that today as well. We look back at some of the old sins that we used to participate in, and we don't look back at them thinking, thank you, God, for delivering me from this. We look back at them longingly. Oh, man, I remember how I used to be. I remember how I used to act. I remember the things I used to engage in. Oh, I miss it. What are we doing? Can you possibly start to miss those things that have broken your relationship with God, have broken your the very image bearer that you're supposed to be? Can you possibly think that about those things when you're also thinking about how God has delivered you and about how God has provided for you every single day since then? No, it would be crazy. There's no possible way that you can think about all the beautiful things that he's done for us and then continue to say, oh, but I really miss those onions. I really miss Egypt. I really miss bondage. Go over to John chapter 8 very quickly, please. John chapter 8. John chapter 8 and verse 12. John 8 and verse 12. It says, then Jesus again spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. He who follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And there are several other things that John has to say about Jesus being the light. We'll even look at a couple of them. But in John chapter 8, does Jesus say, he who looks at me once or twice every now and then will have the light? Or does he say, he who follows me will have the light of life? There's a big difference between following like a true disciple does, like a true student does, not just, temporarily, not just intermittently, but avidly, very closely following the master. That doesn't stop. It's not just once every week, it's every single day. Now, if we truly follow after the light, those things that got the Israelites so stupidly, those things that distracted them from God's blessings, those things won't distract us. But it's only if we start really following him, not just once every now and then I'm going to look and I'm going to see how he wants me to go. And so this brings us to our final point. It kind of has to do with our final point, which is, I think I just have a problem with technology is what it is. The power of God's presence. It really comes back to that first lesson on Monday that Brother Sipe went through. And so we've talked about the need for his guidance, the critical need for his guidance, the assurance that of his deliverance through that light. But we also need to talk about his presence. Over in Numbers chapter 9. Numbers chapter 9. Numbers chapter 9 and verse 15. Once again, I need to stress the fact that this was not just a temporary thing that God had the pillar of light and the pillar of cloud to guide the people. Numbers 9 and verse 15, it says, now on the day that the tabernacle was erected, the cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of the testimony, and in the evening it was like the appearance of fire over the tabernacle until morning. So it was continuously. The cloud would cover it by day and the appearance of fire by night. Whenever the cloud was lifted from over the tent, afterward, the sons of Israel would then set out, and in the place where the cloud settled down, there the sons of Israel would camp. And this just continues. If you just keep reading through the narrative, you're going to find that it does not stop, at least until they get to the promised land. And so after it's actually fulfilled its purpose, that's when it gets them to where they're going. But the pillar of fire represented God's presence with all his people. That's essentially one of the main things I think we're supposed to get from this. What it does is remind the people as they're wandering through the wilderness. It should have reminded the people as they saw Egypt coming up right behind them. It should have reminded them, hey, Remember those promises God has made. God is still with us. He is still among us. Now again, I think it just comes back to, are we focusing on that light, or are we looking just at the soldiers? Are we focusing on that light, or are we focusing on the storm around us? Though they walked through darkness, literally, they were not meant to act like it. And I say that because it's really leading into the passage in 1 John chapter 1, which we're going to look at in just a moment. But when you think about how they were miraculously led by God and His light, and that light being the presence of God, I don't think it was just supposed to be something where they thought, oh, I know that I need to be guided. I know that if I get lost, I can just look up and find the right directions again. Everything's good. I think it was also supposed to be, remember who is among you. Remember who is in your midst. And I think that's one of the reasons why that pillar of cloud always came over the tabernacle. Because what was that but really the dwelling place of God? The place where Moses would go in and speak with God. And then even that would transfer into the temple. But that's kind of a side point. But what do I mean by this when I say that though they walked through darkness, they weren't supposed to act like it? Well, I really want to focus on what John says over in 1 John chapter 1. 1 John chapter 1 and verse 6. Beginning in verse 6, rather, of 1 John chapter 1. It says, the one who says he abides in him, or rather, that's chapter 2, chapter 1. If we say that we have fellowship with him and yet walk in the darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. But if we walk in the light as he himself is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus, his son, cleanses us from all sin. If we say that we have no sin, we are deceiving ourselves, and the truth is not in us. So what are a few things that we're supposed to take from 1 John chapter 1? Like Israel, we have been walking through darkness. When you walk through this world, when we are strangers on this earth, there are moments where we have to focus especially on that light, that guide, on that deliverance. Now, I think a lot of times what happens is, even though we're supposed to be walking in the light, we start looking like Israel. Yes, Israel had a glimpse of that kind of, a fraction of a glimpse of what that dwelling looked like, that God was among them. But I think sometimes even we forget that we have God on our side. We have God in our corner. Not because I am so special, but because He has redeemed us to be that special people that He says He's going to provide for. To walk in the light, we first have to be cleansed of that sin and of that darkness. So before you can even have the confidence that we're supposed to have, you have to be born again, as it says especially in 1 and 2 Peter. The need to be born again, so that way you can be transferred from the domain of darkness into this kingdom of light. And so, again, thinking back to Israel, they kept walking on like they didn't have the light. They would rebel against God. They would complain about the fact that they were suffering and that they were struggling, even though it was right in front of them. I really do believe that there are people like this today. And I know this kind of goes back to some of the points we've made. Come in. I'd never heard that before. Oh, actually, I did last night, and it also freaked me out last night. So anyway, thinking back to Israel, they could have so easily looked back at that pillar of cloud and fire and thought, okay, I remember, God's right there. God is with us. He is among us. I don't need to fear. But I really do believe that people struggle in the same way. And I think maybe sometimes we kind of have an excuse. I don't have the pillar of fire. It's not as easy for me. It was a lot easier for them because they could look at it. I'm not so sure. Because we have something far greater than just a pillar of fire and just a pillar of cloud. We have the very substance. We have what it was pointing towards, which is Christ in us. We have that provision that comes through the light of men. The light of life that comes from Jesus. Now, what does that look like when it comes to just practical application of making sure that we are walking in the light and not just blinded and distracting ourselves thinking that we are, but rather walking in the darkness? I think it means no longer acting like where we came from. Israel was so focused on Egypt. They focused on the pickles, the cucumbers, the onions, the bread. They couldn't get their mind off Egypt. And I think that for us today, we also have to make sure that we get past Egypt, past what kept us in bondage. What might this look like? Yeah, especially when you think about kids. Peer pressure. A lot of the time when they become Christians or when they're thinking about becoming Christians, or just because of the way they act at school or the way they act in college or if they're beginning work, people will start to talk. People will start to say things. And how am I supposed to answer this? And what do we have to do? We have to sit down and we have to talk about, making sure you don't give in to that peer pressure. Making sure that you don't start just because everyone else is acting foolish and acting like the sons of disobedience, those that are still in the domain of darkness. We have to walk in the light and leave the darkness behind. Well, finally, in John chapter 3, beginning in verse 16, I think that this is a good place to end. In John chapter 3 and verse 16, also because it's the end of my notes. John chapter 3 and verse 16, very familiar verse. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send the Son into the world to judge the world, but that the world might be saved through him. Now, he who believes in him is not judged. He who does not believe has been judged already, because he has not believed in the name of this only begotten Son of God. This is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and men love the darkness rather than the light, for their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light and does not come to the light for fear that his deeds will be exposed. But he who practices the truth comes to the light so that his deeds may be manifested as having been wrought in God. So we talked about the need to walk in light, have fellowship with God, and make sure we're not walking in darkness. But what are the steps that we have to take to get there? I think ultimately it comes back to Jesus being the light of men and the very light of life. Have we allowed him to expose the darkness? I think a lot of people act like, oh, of course he has. But what we tend to do is we're willing to let some things be exposed, but not everything. There are some things that I may be, subconsciously ashamed of, and I don't really want this to be exposed by the Bible. And so what do? We hide it so that way it's not exposed, so that way we don't have to change anything. And let me just say, God already knows. But what is this talking about? It's talking about those who are willing to let Christ shine in their lives and get rid of the darkness, get rid of the shadows of doubt, get rid of the shadows of sin and of bondage. What does this look like today? I think it looks like people rejecting God's biblical morality. And they start looking for it outside of the Bible, or they start trying to excuse it looking outside of the Bible, or God's mandate for worship. Instead of letting God be the final authority, what do some people do? Instead of going to his word, instead of letting his light shine and expose the darkness, what we do is decide, okay, I'm actually going to go and do my own thing. I'm going to go and do what the denominations do. I'm going to go and do what some of my friends do. Instead of saying, what does God do? And it's because people are not willing to come to the light, because they're not willing to let go of those shadows of darkness and sin. But the presence of God requires us to walk in light and requires us to allow those things to be exposed. If we do not come to his word with that notion that I am willing to let that, as it says in Hebrews 4 and verse 12, let it expose. He says, you're still going to be in the darkness. And what you're doing is lying to yourself. In fact, you're making God a liar. So we need to be careful that we're not walking in darkness. I can't tell. I think it's still 5 till 15, but are there any comments or questions or clarifications? Well, there's the doorbell again. But I appreciate all the attention.